When an empath heals completely, one of the first things that changes is their definition of love. In the past, intensity may have felt intoxicating. The emotional highs, the late-night conversations, the dramatic reconciliations, all of it felt deep and meaningful. The rush of uncertainty created adrenaline, the unpredictability created obsession, and the empath often interpreted that emotional roller coaster as passion. But healing rewires perception. They begin to realize that intensity is not the same as intimacy. Chaos is not connection, anxiety is not attraction. What once felt electric now feels exhausting. What once felt magnetic now feels unstable. The body, no longer operating from unresolved wounds, stops confusing stress with chemistry. Before healing, the empath's nervous system was often activated in relationships. A delayed message could create spirals of overthinking. A shift in tone could trigger fear. The uncertainty kept them alert, hyper-aware, emotionally invested, and because that heightened state felt powerful, they labeled it love. But complete healing brings regulation. The empath no longer feels drawn to emotional turbulence. They do not crave the chase. They do not romanticize mixed signals. Instead, they notice how their body responds to consistency. Calm communication feels grounding. Clear intentions feel attractive. Reliability feels safe. Peace becomes appealing. This shift can feel unfamiliar at first. Stability may even feel boring compared to the intensity they once knew. But as healing integrates, they understand that boredom is not the right word, safety is. And safety allows love to deepen rather than destabilize. They begin to value emotional maturity over mystery, accountability over charm, consistency over grand gestures. They are no longer captivated by someone who keeps them guessing. They are drawn to someone who makes them feel secure without effort. The most profound change is internal. They no longer equate longing with love. They no longer believe that strong emotion automatically means strong compatibility. They trust their nervous system when it feels calm instead of when it feels activated. When an empath heals completely, love becomes steady rather than stormy. It becomes supportive rather than consuming. It becomes something that enhances their peace instead of threatening it. And once they experience that kind of grounded connection, they never confuse chaos with love again. When an empath heals completely, they stop giving from fear. In the past, overgiving may have felt natural. They were the ones who texted first, checked in often, offered emotional support endlessly. They became the safe place for everyone else. But beneath that generosity, there was sometimes a quiet belief, if I give enough, I will be valued enough to stay. Healing dissolves that belief. The empath begins to understand that love is not earned through exhaustion. They no longer feel responsible for carrying the emotional weight of the relationship alone. They stop volunteering to fix every misunderstanding, smooth every conflict, or compensate for someone else's inconsistency. They realize that mutual effort is not something you beg for. It is something that either exists or it does not. Before healing, giving felt like security. The more they invested, the safer they believed the connection would become. But complete healing reveals a powerful truth: overextension does not create stability. It creates imbalance, so their behavior shifts naturally. They still care deeply, they still love sincerely, but they no longer overfunction. They do not send paragraphs to someone who replies with one word. They do not rearrange their entire schedule for someone who cannot commit to consistency. They do not silence their own needs to avoid conflict. Giving becomes intentional instead of automatic. They pause before investing heavily. They observe whether effort is reciprocated. They allow space for the other person to step forward. And if that effort does not come, they do not chase it. They accept the information and adjust accordingly. This change is not coldness. It is maturity. The healed empath understands that healthy love flows in two directions. It is not maintained by one person's emotional labor. It does not require one partner to be endlessly understanding while the other remains passive. They also stop proving their worth through availability. Their time, energy, and emotional depth are no longer handed out to anyone who shows minimal interest. Access is earned through consistency and respect. When giving is no longer tied to fear of abandonment, it becomes pure. It becomes generous without being self-sacrificing. It becomes loving without being desperate, and in that shift, the empath reclaims their power. They give because they want to, not because they are afraid of losing someone. That difference transforms everything. When an empath heals completely, their boundaries stop feeling negotiable. In the past, they may have struggled to enforce limits because they feared being seen as difficult, selfish, or cold. They often prioritized harmony over honesty. If something hurt them, they minimized it. If something felt wrong, they rationalized it. Keeping the connection intact felt more important than protecting their own peace. But healing strengthens self-respect. The empath begins to understand that boundaries are not rejection, they are protection. They are not punishments, they are clarity. Instead of waiting until resentment builds, they speak up early. Instead of tolerating repeated inconsistency, they address it directly. And if the behavior continues, they adjust their access instead of their standards. Before healing, they might have given endless chances, hoping someone would finally understand. They believed patience would eventually inspire change. But complete healing teaches them that boundaries are not about changing someone else. They are about honoring themselves. So their communication becomes firmer. They say what they need without over-explaining. They decline what feels misaligned without guilt. They no longer soften every statement to make it easier for others to accept. Their tone is calm, but their message is clear. And if someone reacts negatively to a reasonable boundary, they do not immediately question themselves. This is where strength replaces fear. The healed empath no longer confuses tolerance with compassion. They realize that allowing disrespect is not kindness. Ignoring red flags is not understanding, and enduring emotional imbalance is not loyalty. Boundaries also become consistent. They do not bend simply because they feel lonely or nostalgic. They do not collapse when someone offers temporary affection. Their limits are steady because they are rooted in self-worth, not emotion. And something powerful happens when boundaries are unapologetic. The right people feel safe within them. Emotionally mature individuals respect clarity. Only those who benefited from the empath's lack of boundaries feel threatened by them. The healed empath accepts that reality. They understand that losing access to people who resist healthy limits is not a loss, it is alignment. They no longer argue for their right to feel safe and respected. They simply maintain it. When boundaries become firm and peaceful at the same time, the empath's energy shifts. They move through relationships with clarity rather than fear. And that clarity becomes the foundation of every connection they allow into their life. When an empath heals completely, they stop confusing intensity with intimacy. In the past, strong emotions felt like proof. If the chemistry was overwhelming, if the conversations were deep from the beginning, if the connection felt magnetic and consuming, they assumed it must be meaningful. They equated emotional highs with destiny. But healing brings discernment. The empath begins to recognize that intensity can sometimes be a trauma bond, not true compatibility. Fast attachment, dramatic push, and pull cycles, and unpredictable affection no longer feel romantic. They feel destabilizing. What once felt exciting now feels exhausting. They start valuing consistency over chaos. Instead of chasing sparks, they observe patterns. Does this person show up reliably? Do their words match their actions? Is there emotional safety, not just emotional stimulation? The healed empath understands that real intimacy is built slowly, through trust, accountability, and steady presence. Before healing, they might have overlooked red flags because the emotional connection felt powerful. They told themselves, "No one has ever understood me like this." But healing teaches them that being understood is not the same as being respected. Feeling seen is not the same as feeling secure. So their attraction shifts. They are no longer drawn to unpredictability. The silent treatment, the hot and cold behavior, the dramatic reconciliations, these patterns lose their appeal. Instead, they are attracted to grounded energy, calm conversations, mutual effort, emotional regulation. At first, stability may even feel unfamiliar. It may seem less thrilling than the emotional roller coaster they once knew. But with awareness, they begin to appreciate the peace. They realize that nervous system calmness is not boredom, it is safety. The healed empath no longer mistakes anxiety for love. They do not feel compelled to prove themselves to someone who is inconsistent. They do not interpret confusion as chemistry. If they feel constantly uncertain about where they stand, they step back rather than lean in harder. This shift transforms their relationships completely. They choose depth over drama. They choose security over sparks. They choose a connection that grows steadily instead of one that burns brightly and collapses. And in doing so, they experience something new, love that does not deplete them. Love that does not require emotional survival skills. Love that feels peaceful, balanced, and mutual. When intensity no longer controls their choices, clarity does. And that clarity becomes the foundation for a healthier, more sustainable kind of love. When an empath heals completely, they stop seeking validation outside of themselves. For a long time, their sense of worth may have been quietly tied to how needed they were. If someone depended on them emotionally, they felt valuable. If someone praised their kindness, they felt secure. If someone chose them, they felt worthy. But healing shifts the source of that worth inward. The empath begins to understand that being needed is not the same as being loved. Constant reassurance is not the same as self-confidence. External approval becomes a bonus, not a requirement. They no longer scan the room for signs that they are accepted. They no longer replay conversations wondering if they said the right thing. There is a new steadiness inside them. Before healing, silence from someone could trigger anxiety. A delayed response could spiral into self-doubt. A slight change in tone could feel like rejection. They were highly attuned to emotional shifts, and without inner grounding, that sensitivity turned into overanalysis. But complete healing creates internal security. They stop personalizing every fluctuation. They understand that other people's moods are not reflections of their worth. They trust their own intentions. They know when they have shown up authentically, and that becomes enough. This shift changes how they move in relationships. They no longer overperform to maintain interest. They do not exaggerate their generosity to be seen as special. They do not shrink their opinions to stay likable. Their authenticity replaces their need to impress. And when validation is no longer chased, something powerful happens. They become magnetic in a different way, not because they are trying to attract attention, but because they are grounded. There is calm confidence in someone who does not need constant reassurance. The healed empath also becomes more selective about feedback. They listen, but they do not absorb everything. Criticism is evaluated, not automatically internalized. Praise is appreciated, not depended upon. Their identity stabilizes. They know who they are outside of relationships. They have passions, boundaries, preferences, and standards that are not shaped by whoever is in front of them. Approval no longer defines them, and rejection no longer destroys them. When validation moves from external to internal, freedom begins. The empath no longer feels controlled by others' perceptions. They feel rooted within themselves. And from that rooted place, every connection becomes a choice, not a survival strategy. When an empath heals completely, they stop abandoning themselves to keep others comfortable. For years, they may have been the peacekeeper, the one who adjusted their tone, swallowed their truth, and softened their needs so no one would feel threatened. They convinced themselves that maintaining harmony was maturity, that staying quiet was strength, that self-sacrifice was love. But healing rewrites that belief. The empath begins to understand that true harmony does not require self-erasure. Real love does not demand silence. And strength is not measured by how much pain you can quietly endure. So they start choosing themselves. This does not mean they become selfish or indifferent. It means they stop betraying their own feelings. If something hurts, they acknowledge it. If something feels misaligned, they do not ignore the discomfort just to avoid conflict. Their inner voice, once dismissed, becomes their compass. Before healing, they often overrode their intuition. They felt the red flags. They sensed the imbalance. But they told themselves they were overthinking. They gave people the benefit of the doubt at the expense of their own clarity. And each time they ignored that inner knowing, they drifted further from themselves. Complete healing brings them back home. They rebuild trust with their own instincts. They pause when something feels off. They no longer rush to justify someone else's behavior. Instead of asking, "How can I fix this?" they ask, "Does this align with who I am becoming?" That question changes everything. They stop tolerating environments that drain them. They step away from conversations that feel disrespectful. They prioritize rest without guilt. They invest in relationships that feel reciprocal and nourishing. Choosing themselves also means embracing solitude when necessary. They are no longer afraid to be alone if the alternative is misalignment. Loneliness does not intimidate them the way self-betrayal once did, and in that shift, their energy transforms. There is confidence in someone who stands by their own truth. There is peace in someone who no longer negotiates their worth. The healed empath does not chase belonging, they create it within themselves. When they stop abandoning themselves, they stop attracting situations that require understanding. Rise naturally, their circle becomes healthier. Their life becomes aligned. Because the moment an empath fully chooses themselves, everything around them must rise to meet that standard or fall away.